Shannon Ferrell. I don't know how long exactly I've known Shannon. It feels like I've known him a long time.
More than either one of us should admit. That's how long we've known each other.
It would start dating us.
Yeah, let's
Shannon
let's
is,
just say we were hanging out in 4-H together.
yeah, that's probably good enough. But Shannon is currently an associate professor at at Oklahoma State University. I almost screwed up there in the Department of Agricultural Economics, where he specializes in ag law. He grew up on a cattle and wheat operation in western Oklahoma and attained his bachelor's and master's degree in agricultural economics from OSU before obtaining his Juris Doctorate from the Oklahoma City University School of Law with endorsements in estate planning and business and financial services law. Shannon spent a number of years in private practice before focusing on agricultural, environmental, energy, and corporate law before joining Oklahoma State in the summer of 2007. As a member of the Department of Agricultural Economics, Shannon holds an extension and teaching appointment since joining Oklahoma State. He has provided over 300 extension seminars and workshops throughout North America with a cumulative audience in excess of nearly 19,000 while authoring over 50 extension publications. And he makes me feel like I haven't done a whole lot in my time here.
Well, I have been here a little bit longer, so it's okay.
That's true. His extension activities encompass all areas of agricultural law, and he also teaches the agricultural law courses at both Oklahoma State and the University of Oklahoma's College of Law. So I will now hand it off to Shannon and let him get started.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you guys for taking the time to hang out with us today. And first off, I'm going to apologize. As I was telling Paul before the webinar, I woke up sounding just fine, and I usually kind of sound like a nice blend of Barry White and Pavarotti. And then when I got to work, I completely lost my voice, so I've been drinking a lot of therapeutic tea trying to get to where I can speak again, so I apologize if things are a little crackly here. One other thing real quick. I know we're probably talking to a pretty diverse audience of professionals, so if you don't mind, down in the chat window, which I think should be at the lower right side of your screen, if you wouldn't mind just kind of telling me if you are an attorney, if you're an extension professional, if you're a financial professional, just so I can kind of know how to tailor the presentation to you a little bit. This same presentation in various forms we have given to actual, directly to farm producers, we've given it to attorneys, we've given it to financial professionals, and so I think there's a little bit of something for everybody, and there's nothing that says that you can't multiply multiple of those roles simultaneously. Lots of our family farmers are also bankers and lawyers and such, so, and I see that we're filling in there a little bit, and I see Willie is there. Willie, I'm going to talk to Willie in a while there. Hello, Willie, how are you today? Excellent. We've got a really good diverse audience today, so we'll kind of hit a little bit of everything for everybody, hopefully today. The first thing that I always start off with in these presentations is a little bit of a discussion of why transition planning is so important for family farmers and ranchers. And I know that lots of times when I'm giving this part of the presentation, I'm speaking to the choir, but I'm also counting on the choir to be evangelical. In other words, I want producers, whoever's in the audience, to take this information and to go back to their families and explain, hey, this is why we all need to get on board with that. And one of the first reasons is that we're coming up on an unprecedented transfer of wealth in America. Estimates are that in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see approximately 8.4 trillion. That's with a T, that's a lot of money even for the federal government. $8.4 trillion of wealth is going to change hands in the next 20 to 30 years. And the funny thing about that is that it's not going to happen once, it's going to happen twice. What you can see right here is a histogram of United States population, and the bracketed area that I have there, that's the baby boom. That's the largest single generation that we've ever had in terms of American demographics. And that's where the baby boom was in 2000. If we click it forward a little bit, that's what it looks like in the year 2010. And if we went one more, we would see what it would look like in the year 2020. And as you see, we're getting to the part of the histogram where it starts to narrow a little bit, which means that even the baby boom, that biggest population bubble that we've ever had in American demographics, is reaching the age of retirement, and even where older baby boomers are starting to reach the point where we're starting to lose them. Moral of the story is that we don't have forever to work on our family transition problems. This is something that we have to contend with because it's going to become an issue one way or another. And what we see is a lot of generational squeezing in agriculture, particularly because in agriculture, old farmers never retire, right? Old farmers keep farming as long as they can possibly keep farming, and then most of the time, if they have any sort of transition plan in place, that transition plan is focused entirely on their estate plan, which means that all of those assets only transfer when someone passes away. That can kind of get us into a squeeze, though. And take, for example, this farm-owning family from back east. They're even a little bit further back east than you guys are in Maryland. But this family owns about 350,000 acres of agricultural land. Now, for the most part, Mom has been calling the shots, and by most accounts, she's been doing a pretty good job. But Mom's 89 years old. You know, she can't quite keep this gig up forever. Now, her husband tries to help her out as much as he can, but he's 94, and he's had some health problems lately. He's been in and out of the hospital and really hasn't been able to contribute to the operation nearly as much as he would like. Now, Mom and Dad have a choice here. They don't have to keep this operation going until they die. They could turn it over to the next generation. But that next generation is currently 66 years old, at the age of retirement themselves, and they might be saying, look, at this point in my life, I don't want to take on an operation of this size. I just like to go retire myself. Plus, the reason that Mom and Dad haven't really been thinking about transferring the operation to this next generation is because it's shown some lapses in judgment, and they don't really feel confident with that. Well, then that leaves the grandchild. And grandchild's currently 32, so of the age that they could really start taking a management role in the operation, but they still don't have an experience level that makes them comfortable turning over an operation of this size to them just quite yet. Plus, he's got a couple of new kids. One of them's just been born. There's a lot of stuff going on in his life, and they're just not sure that he has the time to devote to really developing the competencies that he needs to take this operation over in the near term. Now, I include this example semi-facetiously, but it's not that facetious. I mean, Paul will do an experiment with his audiences in estate planning where he will just give this story and not put this picture on the screen. And lots of the people in the audience are nodding their heads going, yep, that sounds like my family. That sounds like my family. Because really these ages are pretty typical for what we see in a farm family in the United States. I'll give you another example. I was talking to a colleague of mine, Dave Gaylor, out at the University of Nebraska, who was giving a presentation, and afterwards a gentleman comes up to him and says, hey, at what age do you think it's appropriate for our family to bring in the next generation of the operation? And this gentleman looked to be about 70 years old, and Dr. Gaylor says, oh, are you thinking about bringing your children into the farm? And he goes, no, I'm the kid. My dad's 92. And so I think all of us have kind of seen the fact that lots of our older farmers and ranchers are kind of reluctant to turn over the reins for reasons that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Whatever that reluctance is, though, that reluctance is really pushing a lot of our farmers and ranchers to inaction. 64% of American farms and ranches have no estate plan in place whatsoever. I mean, if those farmers and ranchers pass away, intestate succession is going to be the method that transmits the farm assets to the next generation. And that can cause a lot of problems. If you ask farmers and ranchers what they want to have happen to their operations, I would bet you that nearly 100% of them say in some form or fashion they would like for their farm operation to stay intact, and they'd like to see at least one family member operating it going forward. Well, I'm here to tell you from experience and from research that if you let intestate succession take over, you're almost guaranteeing that's not going to happen. Because in most states, the intestate succession rules are almost always going to dictate that these assets are going to be shared in some form of co-tenancy, and most likely that's going to be between a farm heir and a non-farm heir, and that's going to create tensions that will probably lead eventually to the sale of some or all of the farm assets. Now, we said earlier that lots of farmers and ranchers would like to have their farm stay intact and would like to see a family member continue operating it. Historically, we're doing a really bad job of that. A recent study by the Small Business Institute found that 30% of family-owned businesses survive one generational transfer. So less than a third of these small businesses are making it after just one generation. If you take that down to the next generation, that number drops to 12%. You take it down another generation, that number drops to 3%. So if we in agriculture really want to see our family farms stay intact, we've got to do a better job of getting out in front of the transition planning issue. Now, if you look at the literature, most of the writers on the topic will give you a list of reasons that small family-owned businesses, including farms, don't successfully make that generational transition. And if you kind of try to consolidate those together, they kind of fall into three categories that were basically put forth by Kevin Spafford. And Spafford wrote these out as these three reasons. Number one, inadequate estate planning. Number two, insufficient capitalization. Number three, a failure to prepare the next generation properly. We've kind of already talked a little bit about inadequate estate planning and the fact that intestate succession statutes are almost going to force the sale of some, if not all, of the farm assets and fractionalize those operations below the point which they remain viable. Insufficient capitalization kind of does the same thing except by a different means. Let's say that we have passed on a farm business to the next generation and they've accepted it successfully, but when they accept it, they also recognize that this thing was not generating enough income to support us. And so either those assets get sold off just to try to obtain their value, or we eat into the equity of the business trying to sustain it in what's eventually a futile attempt. So lots of times we see those underfunded businesses maybe make the generational transition, but they don't survive long after that transitional process. And then the last element, failure to prepare the next generation properly, is a problem that we see across all sorts of organizations, not just farms and ranches, but any form of small business or any form of institution. We often fail to recognize that one of the most important assets that we have are our human resources. And if our human resources aren't prepared to take on the roles that they face when they receive the assets, we might as well have broken up the assets in the first place. So that's why we've become much larger proponents here at Oklahoma State University of the transition model. Because the transition model doesn't just transfer everything at death. What the transition model focuses on is developing a plan over time where some elements of management, some elements of ownership, and some elements of profitability are transferred to that next generation so they can gradually acclimate to that role, giving them a much better chance of success in taking over that operation when they do have a majority stake in it, and also providing some means of mom and dad supporting themselves through the investment that they've placed in the farm over their lifetimes. Now, when I talk to audiences, I often show this slide to show why the ladies in the audience should care. I caught myself a few years ago doing these programs, and I realized that when I was talking about a surviving spouse, I always used female pronouns, and I thought, well, that seems kind of sexist, Ferrell. What if these guys survive longer than the ladies? So I did the research, and I found a study by AARP on widowed persons, and that study indicated that 80.3% of widowed persons are female. Under 20% of those widowed persons are male. So statistically speaking, a surviving spouse in a farm transition planning scenario is most likely going to be the wife. And that is important because the statistics also show that widowed females are 3 to 4 times more likely to be below the poverty level than married women of the same age. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that because they're a surviving spouse, widowed women are the first victims of poor estate planning. If we had an operation that was insolvent, or if we had an operation that just didn't have liquid assets that could be moved to pay for things like medical expenses, burial expenses, estate tax obligations if they existed, then they wind up selling those assets. They again have a reduced asset base that's not big enough to support them, and we wind up with this result. So clearly, transition planning has a lot of importance for lots of our farmers and ranchers, and I would argue that everybody needs to have a transition plan. No matter who you are, no matter how big your agricultural operation, you need a transition plan if you care at all about what passes from you to the next generation. But if that's not enough to convince you, then let's talk about some very specific needs for some specific audiences. And I would argue that young families generally are in desperate need of having a good transition plan in place. And the reason for that is that they're probably just beginning with their operation. They're in what we would tend to call the accumulation phase, which means that they're trying to get assets under control, which means they probably have incurred a pretty significant amount of debt. Their debt to equity ratio is probably higher than most other operators. And so if someone dies in that operation and we lose that human resource, we lose the income that it generates, we may not have the income that we need to service those debts. We're going to need to have assets that we're willing to liquidate to pay for those debts, or alternatively, we're going to need to have life insurance or other financial tools in place to cover those debts and those liabilities to avoid putting the farm family into insolvency. That kind of goes the same for farms that may not be owned by young families, but are on the verge of being viable. They've just now reached that critical mass of assets where they're trying to really flip over off dependency from off-farm income and be self-sustaining. But if we have someone die without a transition plan in place, and we see the forced sale of some of those assets, we're now below viable size, and we've created all the problems that we were trying to avoid with that. Families and farms with limited asset liquidity desperately need to have a transition plan. And this can be a farm of any size, an operator of any age. Generally speaking, 85% of the farm asset balance sheet is in long-term assets, and 76% of those long-term assets are land. So, land is not a very liquid asset, and if we've got lots of end-of-life expenses, maybe there was a prolonged illness, or if we do still have debts on the books that we need to pay off, we've got to be willing to sell some of that land, and we have to understand that that land may not sell quickly. Based on vagaries in the market, it may not sell for what we expected it to, and so that again underscores the importance of having that transition plan. Complex families desperately need transition plans. When I say complex, I mean that there's been a previous marriage involved, there may be stepkids involved. If you want to think of a complex family, just think of the Brady Bunch. That's all you need to envision if you want to think about a complex family. And ask yourself, if Mike and Carol were farmers, what would they do? Which of their kids, if any of them, would want to take over the farm operation? Or what about their hired hand? You know, Alice might have wanted to have a role in the operation as well. The intestate succession statutes are going to cause tremendous controversy with complex families if a transition plan isn't in place to supersede those intestate succession statutes. Now, all of this is pretty challenging when we're talking about farms and small family-owned businesses, because in many cases, the business is the retirement asset of the founding generation. There may not be a lot of investment funds, 401ks, IRAs, anything else salted away. In many cases, we see that these producers plow every available penny back into that operation. And so we're simultaneously trying to deal with retirement income for that family while we're trying to transition this farm business to the next generation, and also provide an estate plan for that generation. All of these things are almost inextricably bound together, and that's kind of why the transition approach has some value, is because it enables us to simultaneously address all of these elements rather than trying to isolate them, which would be really tough for us to do. So what's this approach then? We talk about transition for the past 20 minutes here. What are the steps to a successful transition plan? First and foremost, we've got to do a good job of engaging the farm family to determine where they're at right now, both financially and in terms of their values. From a homework standpoint, this is one of the biggest chunks that they face, because we're going to put together a very comprehensive inventory, not just from an asset standpoint, but also from a business relationship standpoint and from a human resources standpoint. Next, we're going to have to actually talk to stakeholders. And I will admit, I don't have a lot of experience in dealing with Maryland agricultural producers, but I know out here on the frontier, we're pretty rough and rugged, and we really don't like talking to our family any more than at all possible. Case in point, my mom discovered text messaging last year, and now she hardly ever has to call me. My family is not very expressive when it comes to emotions, and so this too is going to be pretty tough. We actually have to engage in some deep, meaningful conversations with all of the stakeholders in our family farm operation to determine what their interests are in the operation going forward. Going forward with the transition plan without knowing how your stakeholders feel about their potential roles in the operation is a recipe for frustration, because it doesn't matter how good our plan is, if we don't have that communication and buy-in from those stakeholders, we kind of labor in vain. Our next step is, from the standpoint of the overall farm business, we need to develop a business succession plan. How are we going to transfer the farm business from one generation to the next over time so that everyone has a way to develop into the roles they'll eventually need to fill? And then, how do we develop an estate plan for those holdings that belong personally to the founding generation? Now, that might be an almost complete overlap between the personal holdings of the founding generation and the farm business. It may be 100%, in which case we can still kind of do these things together, but we have to understand that the personal holdings of one individual may be different or maybe the same as the business as a whole, and that's one thing that all the stakeholders need to understand as well. Once we've done all this, we actually then have to deploy that plan. We actually have to put this plan in motion and commit to it with buy-in from all of our stakeholders. So with that, let's talk about all these steps in a little bit more detail. You know, the one frustration that I always had in private practice when I would talk to someone about their estate plan is that they came to me and just said, "Hey Ferrell, tell me whether I need a trust or a will and just write that thing up for me." To which my response was, have you ever tried to go somewhere on a map, but you didn't know where you were? That's like trying to find your way from point A to point B when you don't know where point A is. And that's the mistake that lots of farm families make. They think that they just need to have an estate plan or a will or a trust or something like that, but they never stop to think about not only what their long-term goals are, but they never think about where they're at. How do I get from where I am to where I'm supposed to be? So let's talk a little bit about where point A is. Our map. First off, we've got to do a very thorough inventory of everything that we've got. And I'm not just talking about personal and real property, although clearly that is very important. We need to have an exhaustive, and I mean exhaustive, inventory of the personal and real property held by the people that we're trying to help. And we actually have a few tools available if you want to contact me after the presentation for a couple of those inventories that we've developed or some inventories that we've identified from other resources that are good. Just let me know. I'll have my email address available at the end of the presentation. But we also want to inventory business relationships. Do we have partnerships, joint ventures, relationships with vendors, relationships with consultants? All of those relationships might be more critical than we realize to the day-to-day functioning of our farm business. And so we need to make sure that we've tallied those up as well, because those may need to be preserved and in some way, form, or fashion transition to the next generation as well. We also need to inventory the people. And I mean everybody. Not just the people that we think are interested in taking over the farm operation, but the people that just have some sort of connection. Those stakeholders, and we'll talk about stakeholders here in just a little bit, but we need to have a full picture of all the players involved with this process. We also need to do an inventory of our goals and values. And you might be thinking to yourself, Ferrell, that sounds awfully mushy. What do you mean goals and values? I mean, if you want me to tell you what's the right tool to accomplish your goals, do you know what your goals are? Well, yeah, I just want the farm to go to my kids. Well, okay. Do you want the farm to go equally to all your kids? Do you want it to go to the kids that have an interest in running it? Do you care that the farm stays in one piece? Would it bother you if something was changed, if it was separated apart? That goes to the goals and values of that founding generation and all the stakeholders as well. And so that's something we really need to sit down and talk about with those people as well. Now, as we're doing this inventory, one thing we're really trying to figure out is what's the current financial health of this operation, and is it capable of surviving a transition to the next generation? If we're going to talk about mom and dad gradually stepping back from this operation and letting the next generation take over, mom and dad are probably going to want to have some form of retirement income. And if they've invested in nothing else but the farm operation, well, then we need to ask ourselves, can this farm support 2 people or 4 people or 6 people or 8 simultaneously? To do that, we've got to really ask ourselves, what are mom and dad living off of right now? And we've looked at data from the Kansas Farm Management Association, which is a very good farm management data set. And it suggests that the average family living withdrawal, in other words, the family salary that's paid, for lack of a better word, averaged right about $70,000 a year. But if you back out some things like the provision of vehicles, the provision of housing, and some other benefits that the farm provides, that number actually looks more like $90,000 a year. So you need to ask yourself, if I'm paying each family a living stipend of $90,000 a year, is this farm going to be able to do that? Is this farm going to be able to support that for multiple generations? Do we need to grow the operation? We don't have to consider ourselves as being constrained by the assets that we have. You know, we could acquire additional assets as part of this transition plan if that's what gives us the ability to have multiple generations involved at the same time. Now, if we don't have a business capable of doing that, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. Do we have a business, which is something that's more than the sum of its parts, or do we have a collection of assets? And if we have a collection of assets, something that we don't have to keep intact, something that can be easily broken apart without losing any value, well, then maybe the transition model loses some value for us, and maybe we are just talking about an estate plan. But that's a question that the farm operator has to ask. Next up, we've got to communicate with our stakeholders. And I can't tell you how many times we've run into farmers and ranchers that have just assumed that one of their heirs wants to take over the operation, but none of them do. Or they assume that the kid that lives in town doesn't want any part of the operation, and they would. Or that the kid on the farm wants to continue farming it, and maybe they don't. So all I'm going to tell you today is that if you're trying to help someone through this transition process, it's critical that you talk to all of the stakeholders to figure out what do they want to do with the farm. Maybe it's this place that has emotional value for them, and they just want to see it preserved in some way. Some people might have a very deep desire to operate it as a business going forward, and the people that you think might care about it might not. So just remember the old joke that the farmer will tell you about what happens when you assume. You can fill in the blank from there, okay? So when we're talking to our stakeholders, who are those stakeholders? Well, stakeholders come in a large variety. Stakeholders may be people with a management stake, the people that actually have management authority in the operation. Those people are pretty easy to identify. They're probably the one that came to you for help in the first place. But there's other stakeholders as well, people that have a financial investment. Now, the manager probably has a financial investment themselves, but if someone's making a salary from the farm, they've got a financial stake in it too, and they probably care about its progress. So any employees that you have likely are financial stakeholders. Anyone who receives income or benefits from the farm, they're financial stakeholders. And then you also have emotional investors or emotional stakeholders. Let me give you an example from my own life. I grew up, like Paul said, on a farm in western Oklahoma, and I'm a professor at OSU now. I live 150 miles away from my family farm. But if you ask me where home is, I won't ever tell you Stillwater. I'll tell you Leedy, Oklahoma, because that's where I grew up. I care a lot about what happens to the farm, even though I don't have a financial stake in it. I'm very emotionally invested in it. And sometimes emotional investors can be the most problematic because sometimes they get ignored and nobody likes being ignored. You might also need to engage some other stakeholders that might include the professionals, the vendors, the consultants that you work with, because they might have some valuable insights about your operations progress that you might not realize. Now, as you're having this conversation, I'm going to strongly recommend that you have a series of family meetings. And everyone always feels great when someone says, hey, listen, we need to talk, right? Anytime someone says those words to you, you immediately panic. But you needn't panic. We're going to be open and transparent about this conversation and get everyone engaged because you really want to get everyone's feelings out on the table. You're going to find that lots of the problems caused after someone passes away, when we're having will contests or all sorts of family strife, It's simply because someone never had a chance to be heard with respect to how they felt about the family or how they felt about the farm operation. So initially, some of these family meetings are just going to be to get everyone's emotions out on the table, to understand how everyone feels about their relative position and how they feel about the farm operation. And once we've done that, then we can start having some deeper, meaningful conversations about how the mechanics of that transition actually need to take place. So, as you're having this family meeting, there are some considerations to take into consideration. First off, engage all of the stakeholders. Everyone with a financial stake, everyone with a management stake, everyone with an emotional stake. No one should feel left out. As soon as someone feels left out, we start to lose value from the process. We're going to tell them, we're going to have a talk about the future of the farm. There's not going to be any pretense. There's not going to be any surprises. We're not just going to say, hey, we need to talk to you about something important. We're going to tell them exactly what they're going to talk about so they can feel prepared for that. We're going to do this on some date that is not a holiday, which is when every farm family always wants to do this because they know that everyone's going to be in the same place at the same time and it's convenient. Well, the holidays have enough stress of their own, and we don't need that. Similarly, we're not going to let the stress of this discussion negatively influence the holiday. So we need to have this on some date that's not a holiday for those reasons, but also we're trying to impress upon these stakeholders that this is an important conversation. It's so important we're setting aside time to do it on its own. It carries its own weight. We're going to do this in some place that's comfortable for everyone, but that's not anyone's home. This is going to be a neutral field game, to borrow the sports analogy, because if you're in someone's home, they're going to wield more emotional influence than the people who don't live there. And we need this to be as neutral a playing field as possible because we, again, want everyone to feel comfortable expressing themselves. We also want to make this a place that's free of distractions. In other words, everyone's cell phones go into a box and the box goes outside the room. Similarly, we're going to make arrangements with a hired hand or someone else to take care of the cattle, to take care of the crops. We're going to have no outside activities this day. We're just doing this and focusing on our discussion about the future of the farm. I would also suggest that if this is going to take a while, do it in some place that's fun. That way you can go have some discussion. Things might get a little bit heavy, so you can take a break, go outside, have some fun, maybe do this at a state park or lodge or resort, somewhere you can mix some fun stuff and some difficult stuff to kind of keep things balanced out and overall make it a positive experience for the family. Now, as you're having these conversations, whether you're doing this as a professional facilitating the discussion or whether you're a part of it yourself, understand that the manner in which we communicate may be actually more important than the actual words that we use. And you may remember this from when you took speech in college, but realistically, only 7% of the information conveyed in a conversation is actually relayed through the words that you use. 38% of it is your tone of voice. 55% of it is body language and nonverbal messages. So you add all that up, that's the message you're communicating. 7% the actual words you use, the other 93% are nonverbal, really. And I would love to give you an example of my body language, but this is a webinar and you can't see me. So suffice it to say, how you are holding yourself, the tone of voice that you're using, all of those things matter. So I can't actually illustrate the tone of your voice over a webinar. Saying to one of your stakeholders, hey, I really want to hear what you have to say about the future of the family farm is a lot different from, I'd really like to hear what you have to say about the future of the family farm. You know, again, exact same words, but very different tone, and tone makes a lot of difference. Again, with these meetings, we're trying to get our stakeholders to lean in, to engage, and to feel like they've really got some buy-in in this process. That's good from an emotional standpoint for the family, but it's also good from a legal mechanical standpoint as well, because if we've got buy-in, we've reduced the opportunities that we have for other people to contest the plan that we eventually devise, and that's just good for our clients. Speaking of clients, if you're a legal professional or you're a consultant, one thing that you often have to worry about is who is the client when you're talking to a family. If I just have one client in my office and I'm speaking solely to them, that's pretty easy. But when you're engaging a family, you've got to be very clear about who is and who is not the client. Odds are they didn't come into your office wearing a t-shirt that says, "Excuse me, I'm the client," all right? So it may be important for you to have a discussion, maybe through the form of an engagement letter, to everyone involved in the family to say, I'm here to help this family with their transition plan, but you need to understand that I am dealing specifically with this person or this person as the client. For example, if you're looking at the Maryland Lawyers' Rules of Professional Conduct, they specifically mention this kind of case in the comments to the rules, and they kind of underscore the fact that the lawyer should make clear who they're engaging and who they have not engaged. So if you're a professional, you're helping others, just remember to consider that. Be very clear about who your client is. If you have any conflicts rules, who holds the priority in that conflict, and having a good engagement letter that specifies this is the scope of my work, here's who I'm working for, and here's who I'm not working for. And maybe share that with other members of the family as well to say, you're encouraged to get your own counsel or your own advice on these matters. I'm here to help, but at the end of the day, I represent this person, and they're who my professional obligation is to. Okay, once we've gotten that conversation underway and we're starting to get some meaningful input from all of our family members about who wants to be involved going forward, who doesn't, what their interests are with respect to the operation, now we can start talking about how to transition that business to that next generation. First off, we're going to figure out who's going to be involved and who's going to be involved in what capacity. For example, if we have an heir to the farm that's living on the farm or that's involved in its day-to-day operations, they might want to have at least some role in those daily management decisions, the kind of the tactical analysis, so to speak. If we've got off-farm heirs, again, maybe some of those emotional stakeholders, we might decide to give them some financial stake in the operation. We might not, by the way, but they may not want to be involved in the day-to-day tactical decisions, and the founding generation and the on-farm heirs might not want them involved in the day-to-day tactical stuff. But the things that are more big picture, the things that are strategic decisions, we might want to get some level of input from them because, again, that gives them a sense of buy-in, and they may be the ones directly impacted by those strategic decisions. So we may need to think about how we're going to involve them in those discussions. We're also going to talk about everyone's financial stake. And I'm kind of surprised when I talk to farmers and ranchers that they always assume that they have to give their farm to their kids. And I say, well, you know what? You could make them invest in it. There's nothing that says you have to give away all the farm. You might want to say, hey, it's important for us to grow this operation, to get bigger, to become more financially efficient, and to be able to support more families. We're going to need equity to do that. Will you invest? And that's a fair question to ask of your stakeholders as well. We need to have a blueprint also for how we're going to create new roles, if new roles are going to exist. And how are we going to change existing roles? The classic example of this is moving the founding generation from the role of being CEO to chairman of the board. And that may not sound a whole lot different, but a CEO has a lot of involvement in the day-to-day decisions of that farm operation. And the chairman of the board still basically holds the ultimate veto power, but they don't necessarily get involved in the day-to-day operations. And so if mom and dad are looking at maybe retiring a little bit, and I know that retirement is a dirty word in agriculture, but sometimes it is what it is, we might need to say, Mom and Dad, here's the new role for you. We still want you to have a meaningful, important function in the farm operation, but you don't have to bug yourself with the day-to-day operations, okay? Similarly, if we're bringing someone else on that's new to the operation, we need to have a pretty clearly defined role for them. I know you probably think it sounds crazy for you to have an organizational chart and position descriptions for your farm, but you'd be amazed at how many problems that can actually avoid. When people have clearly defined roles, they know what their jobs are, they know what other people's jobs are, you can actually avoid a lot of conflict before it even starts. So actually consider doing that. We also need to remember that as the founding generation transitions to maybe what might be a semi-retired or retired role, they still need to have meaningful involvement because it can be tremendously emotionally unhealthy if we kind of just say, thanks for all that you did, Mom and Dad, now go off and fish, and they don't do something meaningful for themselves, that can be very harmful for them. So we need to be mindful of making sure that there are meaningful contributory roles for that founding generation to have, no matter what our transition plan takes into account. Now, as we're talking about transitioning the business, there are a couple of common scenarios that we run into that I'd kind of like to put in front of you. And one of those is dealing with the farm kid, city kid conundrum. Or we may see these called operating heirs and non-operating heirs, on-farm heirs, off-farm heirs, lots of different names. But really what we're talking about is that one or more potential heirs to this operation live on the farm, intend to have some role in this operation going forward on a day-to-day basis, and may actually consider it their main source of income. Then we may have an off-farm or non-operating heir that's pursued their vocation elsewhere. They still care about the farm, they still care about Mom and Dad, but it's never really their intention that they come back and operate that farm operation. So, when we're dealing with this, we have to understand that it's possible that farm kid and city kid both love Mom and Dad very much, both care very much about the farm, may have no greedy intentions or motivations, but they are going to view the farm asset differently simply because that's their economic interest. If you're talking about the on-farm heir or the farm kid, they probably look at the asset as a business, and they realize value from their asset in reinvesting in the business, helping it to grow, expanding it, improving its efficiency, growing in scale so that it provides more returns, essentially so that the pie is bigger over time. Now, if you're talking about city kid, a city kid who receives a farm asset is going to look at it like an investment. And there's two ways to get money out of an investment. It either needs to generate returns, i.e. dividends, or you sell it to realize the value of the asset and go invest that in something else. This is not because of anything that's wrong with either of these heirs. Those are just their economic perspectives. And you have to understand that if you put both of those people together in the same asset, those fundamentally juxtaposed positions are going to create conflict. Doesn't matter if we're talking about a farm or any other kind of asset. If one owner looks to grow the value of the business as a whole, they may make decisions that are directly contradictory to the owner that wants to see short-term returns. We see this in the stock market and with large corporations all the time. So what I'm telling you is, you don't always have to treat city kid and farm kid the same. I see it so many times that Mom and Dad think that they have to give the farm in exactly equal shares to all the kids because they can't treat one kid differently. And I'll tell you, again, going from my own family experience, that the word equal does not mean the same thing as the word equitable. Using my own family, I have a brother who farms with my mother and father. And through his work with Mom and Dad, they've doubled the size of the farm operation in the past 10 years. I provide occasional legal help for them, but that's about it, okay? And so for me to get the same share of the farm as the farm kid, my brother, that wouldn't be equitable because he's made much bigger contributions to the operation than I have. And so one thing we have to talk about with our clients and the people that we consult with is that it may not be possible to successfully treat everyone equally. Treating everyone equally may generate more conflict than treating everyone unequally, so long as that unequal treatment is equitable. So what we may be looking at then when we're talking about farm kids and city kids is first off figuring out what roles they want to play. Again, having that family discussion and that conversation may actually lead city kid to the conclusion of, oh, you know what? I really haven't made a lot of contributions to this operation. Maybe I don't want to have a daily role in it. Maybe I just would kind of like to have some form of inheritance, but I'm really not going to be active in the farm operation. Some of these problems may actually work themselves out. But at the very least, you can have a discussion to say, we think it may be more fair that this on-farm heir receives more of the farm assets, and off-farm heir, what we'll try to do instead is provide non-farm assets, maybe in the form of investments, savings, perhaps liquidation of some assets, perhaps the form of a life insurance policy to you so that you get some value, even though that value may not be equal to what the on-farm heir is going to receive at the end of the day. Again, that underscores that importance of having that family discussion on that point. Another thing that we see a lot in agriculture is the sweat equity plan, which is basically kind of a form of non-estate planning, or basically saying that we're going to provide a on-farm heir who's worked for well below market wage with a higher proportion of the farm assets as a form of basically backloaded compensation to that on-farm heir. Now these relationships have a lot of problems. One of them is a lack of transparency, just because the other heirs don't see this deal take place or don't know about it, and that kind of increases the risks that we face of contests of the plan. It's really not very enforceable. Lots of times if you've got a sweat equity plan, you've never embodied that in any sort of legally enforceable document. And so that creates lots of problems. And also it masks profitability problems. If I can't afford to pay someone a market wage, maybe my farm is not as profitable as it needs to be, and we're running that risk of an undercapitalized operation that we talked about in those very first few slides here. If you are going to go with a sweat equity plan, you need to at least make that plan available to anyone else that wants to buy in with their own sweat, and create opportunities then to involve those heirs if they've chosen to do so. If we don't have a successor, if we don't have an heir that wants to come back to the farm operation, then we need to consider what we're going to do next. Do we want to liquidate assets? And that's almost anathema to lots of agricultural producers, but it's a strategy that does have to be considered, because that might be what we need to do to provide retirement income or to provide for end-of-life expenses for that founding generation. We could hire an operator and basically kind of create a successor, or we could seek an outside successor that we're going to gradually transfer control to over time. Now, as we're selecting that successor, one thing that we need to do is an incredibly thorough job of evaluating their skill set. And we might want to make that so thorough that we basically create an internship, for lack of a better word, or a employment relationship, so we can observe that successor at close range over time to make sure that we have similar operating philosophies, or at least operational philosophies that are compatible with the assets that we own. We need to make sure that there's some sort of relationship that we can use to transfer that asset control. And that may be a partnership, it may be a joint venture. We might want to establish some sort of lease, particularly maybe a share lease, because in a share lease we could both have some opportunity to work together in management and kind of get a feel for each other. Or we could talk about some sort of preferred sale, maybe an installment sale over time, to give that successor access to those assets. Whatever we choose to do, though, we need to make sure that we formalize that relationship in a legally enforceable way, because if not, we might as well have not engaged in the whole process in the first place. And as we're talking about transitioning our farm assets over time, one thing that's important for us to remember is that we can split apart elements of our farm. We can talk about ownership as being separate from control, as being separate from economic participation. We can actually look at a number of stakeholders, and we can transfer all of these elements in one chunk to one of them, or alternatively, we could look at these elements and break them apart a little bit to accomplish our goal of treating everyone equitably, even if not that treating them equally. For example, it may be important for us to give day-to-day operational control to an on-farm heir. What we could do to accomplish that would be to put the ownership of the assets in an LLC or corporation, giving voting shares to the on-farm heir and giving non-voting preferred shares to an off-farm heir. That way, off-farm heir still gets some income from the farm operation, but doesn't have a lot of say in the day-to-day tactical decisions. On-farm heir has that level of control and has some freedom to grow the farm asset in a way that he or she feels comfortable with, providing value to them, while also providing that value to the off-farm heir in the form of their dividends or returns. So, there are lots of ways that this can be done. That would be a completely separate webinar and probably a 3-credit class in law school if we talked about all of those. But just to know that those are some elements that are out there for you to consider. Now, if we're talking about the estate planning piece, in other words, these are the personal holdings of a member of the founding generation, and we need to have a plan for transferring those personal holdings at the conclusion of the transition plan when that person's passed away. There's a suite of things that we need to consider. One thing that, again, gets overlooked by young families are the guardian nominations for minor children. If you've got anyone involved with a family that has kids under the age of 18, I cannot overstress how important that guardian nomination is. Let's get someone to take care of those kiddos, because if we don't do that, we create a risk for lots of very divisive family conflict. Beneficiary designations for any investment or savings accounts that we have are an underrated transition tool, very inexpensive, very effective. Let's make sure those beneficiary designations are also checked up on anytime that there is a change in family status. Powers of attorney for both business and healthcare, very important. End-of-life issues or long-term incapacity issues can't be overlooked, and so we need to have someone that we trust with that business power of attorney. That power needs to be I'm sorry, let me back up just a second. Those powers of attorney need to be made durable if we need to make sure they're available while someone is incapacitated, and your attorney can help you create the language that you need to make sure those powers are durable, rather than let me back up, I'm sorry. Durable power of attorney meaning that the power is available while the person is incapacitated. A ordinary power of attorney is ineffective once a person becomes incapacitated. So if in the past you executed a power of attorney for someone and just kind of forgot about it, that power won't be any good if you become incapacitated. It has to be a durable power of attorney to last. An advance directive for healthcare is another very important piece that's often overlooked. And when we talk about an advance directive, that can include a healthcare proxy or healthcare power of attorney, meaning that we're giving someone the capacity to make medical decisions for us if we can't be communicated with or if we're incapacitated. But it can also include items about organ donations, tissue donations, and living will, or any decisions that we have made for ourselves about end-of-life care, such as hydration, nutrition, resuscitation, anything that we do or don't want to administer to us at end of life. Obviously, then there's the will, and the will is a set of instructions that transfers property when someone dies, period. That's what a will is, no more, no less. I would argue that everybody needs to have a will, even if they do have a fairly comprehensive trust, for a reason that we'll explain here in just a second. But I would argue that everybody needs to have a will. Trusts are a good idea for many people. Not everybody has to have a trust. They've been sold as the silver bullet for some time now, and they're not necessarily a panacea, but they do have a lot of flexibility and a lot of advantages. If we do have a trust, it still needs to be paired with a will, because that will needs to round up anything that doesn't get put into the trust and put it into the trust, if we intend for the trust to be our primary estate planning vehicle. And then I would also argue that life insurance sometimes gets undervalued. Young people often have life insurance because they're worried about the payment of debts or providing for their dependents. Older folks might still want to consider life insurance, again, for the farm kid, city kid problem, to cover any estate tax obligations or to deal with any administration costs or end-of-life costs such as medical expenses. So life insurance is something everyone should think about. I'm not going to say that everybody needs to have it, but this is something, again, that you should consider as part of your toolkit. I know we don't have a lot of time, and there are other resources out there to talk about these topics, so let's go through this very quickly. When we talk about wills, lots of people really shy away from wills because they're worried about probate issues. And that's a valid concern because probate takes time, probate takes money, and probate is a public process, meaning those records are publicly accessible to anybody that wants to see them. What I will say, though, is that if you're going to have any sort of estate plan, it's got to include a will. They're very flexible, very powerful tools that can be used even in conjunction with other tools like a trust. So I would argue that everyone needs to have a will that's closely coordinated with their other estate planning tools. And if there is a will, the will has to be probated. Wills have no legal effect unless they are probated. And I routinely deal with people that are probating wills that are 20 and 30 years after the deceased passed away, because they've now run into the problems that are created by not probating a will, which includes cloud of title, amongst other things. So have a will, and once the decedent has passed away, make sure that will gets probated. Trusts are tremendously flexible tools, but they have their own constraints as well. They tend to front load the costs of estate administration. In other words, if we have a trust, we're probably paying a lot of the costs of administering our estate up front, but that might actually be a good thing for us. Trusts can be very flexible. They can provide for restrictions of property use if that's important to us over time. They can provide for minors at the time that we make out the trust, which is more difficult to do under a will. So they've got a lot of flexibility. Just know that they add some cost, they add a little bit of complexity, and again, they still need to be coordinated with other estate planning tools, including a will. No matter how good your trust is, you still need to have a will. Once we've gone through all these steps, then, let's talk about how we deploy our plan. And as we go through this process, we need to make sure we've got a good team of professionals and that those professionals actually work together. I'm actually helping a family right now that had an excellent accountant, they had an excellent attorney. The only problem was that they never talked to each other. And that wasn't because of any sort of animosity, they just worked in their own individual silos. And so now what we're trying to do is pull those professionals together to understand that they're trying to both accomplish goals of the farm family, and those goals have to be linked in the documents and the tools that those two professionals are creating. So engage a good professional team and make them work together. Invite them to the meetings and establish that network for them. Talk to your stakeholders. Make sure they understand what your transition plan is. Be very transparent with them, share the plan with them, and help them to understand what they would need to do if that plan actually had to be implemented today. If we had someone from the founding generation pass away today, what would everyone's roles be? Would they be capable of fulfilling them? And if not, what training do we need to take place to make sure they are capable of fulfilling those roles? Know that this is going to be an ongoing process for the rest of everyone's lives involved. You can't just form a transition plan and then put it in a nice leather-bound notebook on the shelf and let it gather dust. You've got to routinely reevaluate these plans and see that any changes need to be made. So when do you need to do that reevaluation? First off, when there's a change in the family, whenever someone's born or someone dies, whenever there's a change in marital status, whether that's someone getting married or someone getting divorced, whenever someone becomes disabled for any substantial period of time, because that may mean that they have medical expenses that now need to be addressed in the transition plan. It may also mean that they're not capable of fulfilling the role that we had in mind for them, and so we need to figure out how to deal with that human resource need as well. Anytime that we buy or dispose of a major piece of property or any other form of asset, we need to make sure that the transition plan takes that into account. Anytime there's a major change in laws. For example, the turmoil that we saw with the estate tax between 2009 and 2011. I mean, if you go from 2009, we had an estate tax exemption of $3.5 million. It became infinite in 2010, and then it came back down to, I think 5 million, I'm sorry, in 2011. And so during that period of time, people needed to be looking at their transition plans to make sure that they were accounting for that in their estate tax planning. Lastly, you need to do this on a regular basis. I would argue at least every year, just to make sure that your transition plan is accomplishing what you want it to, and if it's not, you can change it. But at least every 2 or 3 years, again, to make sure there hasn't been any major legal change or any significant change in the asset basis of the operation. We've talked about a lot of stuff today. We've talked about a lot of stuff really fast. But at the end of the day, people are surprised when I say this, but picking the financial and legal mechanical tools to accomplish transition planning, that's actually pretty easy. That's not the hard part. The hard part is engaging the family in the deep, meaningful conversations to help them truly understand what they want to accomplish with their transition plan, and then getting them to buy in to this transition process. People are scared to do that. Nobody likes to talk about their own mortality. But we've got to do this if we care about our families. So be prepared, not scared. And you'll find that once you've got people into this process a little bit, they really start to feel good about it. And I can say from my own personal experience, when I got my estate plan in place, I felt so much better. Yeah, I didn't want to do it, but I did it. And now when I'm going off and traveling on an extension trip, I always try to be safe, but I'm not as concerned that, oh my gosh, if something happens to me, what's going to happen to my family? We've got the tools in place to provide for their safety and security for many years to come, and I think their stakeholders will really enjoy that sense of security that they get once they go through this process. Now, since I talked really fast and did so with a gravelly voice. If you'd like to have a copy of the presentation, Paul can take care of that for you. If you'd like a copy of some of the inventory tools that we've developed or some of our references, shoot me an email at this address. That's shannon.l.ferrell@okstate.edu. And that middle letter there, that's an L, not a 1, not an I. So shannon.l.ferrell@okstate.edu. And we're happy to send you anything that we have that will be of assistance to you. With that, I know we've gone our hour. If anybody has any text questions that they want to pop in really quick, let me know. Otherwise, Ashley and Paul, and again, feel free to correspond with me via email. I'm happy to help out any way that I can. I want to thank Paul for having me as his guest on this webinar. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. Thank you, guys. And we tried to create what we thought was a concise inventory, and it's wound up being 8 pages long so far. So that's our concise inventory. Ha ha ha. That's right, and with this inventory, that's a tremendous value add. You know, when we talk to lots of our stakeholders,
thank you everyone,
and we tell them, you know, here's this first step. There's a lot of value in that inventory because, number one, if you go to a professional like an attorney or an accountant, they're going to make you turn around and fill out an inventory anyway, so there's the expense that you've had in that first office visit. But you also find that as you're creating that inventory, it really jump starts your thought process about what you want to see happen in this transition plan. And so it's got value beyond just keeping all the information together, which is critical. It really starts the transition planning process before you even realize it.
Shannon, I think we lost you.
Oh, yes, and we've got we've got the inventory kind of in an outline form. We're working on putting it into an Excel spreadsheet so you can actually have all the information electronically, and then you could dump it to whatever resource you want. Thanks to some macro patches in Excel, we haven't got that Excel template put together yet. We're still trying to work out some of the programming issues, but we do have that outline form, and if you'll email me, I will send that back your way so you can at least have it in the outline form. Also, this isn't an endorsement,
just to reiterate,
but
everyone who wants the inventory from Shannon, you can go ahead and
has a document put together called the Family Love Letter. And really, it's kind of a inventory in a narrative form. It's kind of a workbook that you can go through and fill in a lot of the information of that inventory. Again, we're not endorsing AXA, but as we reviewed a lot of the publicly available resources out there, we found that to be a pretty good document as well. So if you know someone with AXA Financial Advisors, ask them for a copy of that document called the Family Love Letter, and it's a pretty good tool as well.
Get that form to you. And if that's it for the day, I'll go ahead and end the recording, and thank you again. Thank you, Shannon. Have a good day, everyone.